I'm Jessica Martinez, and at 31 years old, I never imagined I'd become the person who destroyed my parents' 25th wedding anniversary by exposing 3 years of financial lies in front of 80 guests. What was supposed to be a celebration of love and success turned into the most brutal family confrontation of my life when I finally decided to show everyone exactly who had been funding my parents' picture-perfect lifestyle. The devastating words, "you ruined our lives," still haunt me, especially coming from my mother who had built her entire identity around a facade I had been secretly maintaining. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling the people you care about most, even when it means watching their world crumble in front of everyone they wanted to impress. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the sun-baked suburbs of Ahwatukee, just outside Phoenix, our family always looked like we had it all figured out. My father, Bob Martinez, was a respected high school math teacher who commanded attention in any room with his booming laugh and endless stories about his students' achievements. My mother, Linda, worked part-time at an upscale boutique in Scottsdale Fashion Square, always impeccably dressed and quick to mention her employee discount when complimented on her outfits. To anyone looking from the outside, we were the picture of middle-class success in Arizona's growing suburban landscape. The truth, however, was far more complicated than the carefully curated image my parents worked so hard to maintain. While Dad earned a decent salary for a teacher and Mom brought in supplemental income from retail, their combined $65,000 a year was nowhere near enough to support the lifestyle they insisted on living. They drove matching luxury SUVs, had renovated our modest 3-bedroom house into something that belonged in a home and garden magazine, and never seemed to hesitate when it came to expensive dinners, designer clothes, or elaborate gifts for family and friends. My younger brother Mike, 28 and perpetually optimistic about his future as a freelance graphic designer, lived in a trendy downtown Phoenix loft that I knew cost more per month than most people's car payments. He spent his days creating beautiful digital art and his evenings at gallery openings and networking events, always impeccably dressed in clothes that somehow appeared in his closet without him ever seeming to worry about how he afforded them. Mike had inherited our father's natural charisma and our mother's eye for aesthetics, making him the kind of person who could walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention. I, on the other hand, had always been the practical one. While Mike was discovering his artistic talents in high school, I was working part-time at a local accounting firm, learning the basics of financial management from people who understood the difference between income and expenses. After graduating with a degree in accounting from Arizona State University, I landed a solid position at a mid-sized firm in Tempe, where I helped small business owners navigate their finances and tax obligations. My apartment was simple but comfortable, furnished with pieces I had saved for and purchased outright rather than financing. I drove a reliable Honda Civic that I had bought used and maintained meticulously, and I had been steadily building my savings account since my first paycheck. The shift in our family dynamics began subtly about 3 years ago, when I started noticing small signs that my parents' financial situation wasn't as stable as it appeared. Dad would mention being short on cash until his next paycheck, always with a laugh and a comment about how expensive it was to maintain their beautiful home. Mom would casually mention that her credit card was acting up when we went out to dinner, automatically expecting someone else to pick up the tab. These moments were always presented as temporary inconveniences, minor hiccups in their otherwise successful financial management. The first time they directly asked for help, it was framed as a simple favor between family members. Dad called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying that particular tone of casual confidence that I had learned to recognize as a warning sign. The mortgage payment was going to be a few days late due to some confusion with automatic transfers, and rather than pay the late fee, wouldn't it make more sense for me to just cover them this once? They would pay me back as soon as Dad's next paycheck cleared, of course. It was just a matter of timing, really, and they would be so grateful for my help in avoiding the unnecessary penalty. I transferred the $1,500 without hesitation, telling myself that this was what family did for each other. When the repayment didn't come after 2 weeks, I assumed they had forgotten in the chaos of their busy lives. When a month passed without mention of the loan, I convinced myself that bringing it up would be petty and small-minded. After all, I had the money to spare, and they were my parents who had sacrificed so much to raise Mike and me. If I could help them avoid financial stress, wasn't that a form of gratitude for everything they had given us? What I didn't realize at the time was that my willingness to help without asking questions had established a pattern that would define our relationship for years to come. The requests became more frequent, though they were never presented as requests. Instead, they came as updates about unexpected expenses, comments about how expensive everything had become, or observations about how responsible and successful I had become compared to other young people they knew. Mom would mention that the car payment had gone up due to some change in their loan terms, sighing about how difficult it was to manage all these financial details. Dad would talk about wanting to take Mom somewhere special for their anniversary, but being concerned about depleting their savings account. Each time, I found myself offering to help before they had to ask directly. It felt like the natural thing to do, the generous thing to do, and certainly the thing that would prevent any awkwardness or tension in our family relationships. I told myself that I was fortunate to be in a position where I could support my parents, and that someday when I had children of my own, I would hope they would be equally willing to help if I found myself in a difficult situation. Mike remained blissfully unaware of these financial arrangements, continuing to receive what appeared to be generous support from our parents for his artistic pursuits. When he landed a commission or sold a piece, he would take us all out to celebrate at expensive restaurants, picking up the tab with obvious pride in his success. When work was slow, he never seemed worried about making rent or buying groceries, always confident that things would work out as they always had. I envied his ability to focus entirely on his passion, without the constant underlying anxiety about money that had become such a dominant part of my own life. As my secret financial support, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Continued. I began keeping detailed records of every transaction. Initially, this was just a habit from my professional training, a way to ensure that I could track the loans for eventual repayment. Over time, however, the spreadsheet became a stark visual representation of just how extensive my support had become. Mortgage assistance, car payments, credit card minimums, home improvement expenses, and what my parents euphemistically called temporary cash flow issues, added up to numbers that shocked even me when I calculated the totals. The most painful aspect of this arrangement wasn't the money itself, though the financial impact on my own life was significant. What hurt most was watching my parents accept praise and admiration from friends and family for their financial success and stability, knowing that their lifestyle was only possible because of my silent sacrifices. At family gatherings, relatives would comment on how well Bob and Linda were doing, how beautiful their renovated house looked, and how generous they were to support Mike's artistic career. My parents would graciously accept these compliments, sometimes even offering advice to younger family members about financial planning and budgeting. Uncle Frank, Dad's older brother who had built a genuinely successful construction business, would often praise my parents for their financial wisdom during family barbecues. He would point to their home improvements and new vehicles as evidence of smart planning and hard work, using them as examples for his own children about the rewards of responsibility and dedication. Meanwhile, Aunt Patricia, Mom's younger sister who worked as a nurse, would express admiration for how Linda managed to always look so put together and stylish, wondering aloud how she managed to afford such beautiful clothes on a teacher's and retail worker's salaries. These conversations made me increasingly uncomfortable, but I found myself unable to speak up without feeling like I was betraying my parents' trust and destroying their reputation in front of people whose opinions they clearly valued. I told myself that their pride was more important than my discomfort, and that eventually the financial situation would stabilize and they would be able to repay me. In the meantime, I would continue to be the responsible daughter who helped her family without expecting recognition or gratitude. The breaking point began building several months ago, when Mom started dropping hints about their upcoming 25th wedding anniversary. She had always dreamed of having a big celebration, she mentioned, during one of our weekly phone calls. Something elegant and memorable that would bring together all the people who had been important in their marriage. Dad deserved recognition for his dedication to education and his students. and she wanted to honor their partnership with an event that reflected how blessed they had been over the past quarter century. Initially, these conversations seemed like harmless daydreaming, the kind of wishful thinking that people engage in when imagining ideal scenarios. Mom would describe the perfect venue, the decorations she envisioned, and the guest list of family and friends who would be so happy to celebrate with them. She researched catering options, visited potential locations, and began creating Pinterest boards filled with anniversary party inspiration. Dad supported her enthusiasm, encouraging her to think big and plan something truly special that would create lasting memories for everyone involved. As the planning became more concrete, however, it became clear that my parents' vision for their anniversary celebration was far beyond their actual financial means. The venue Mom had fallen in love with was Casa Grande Ballroom, an upscale event space in Scottsdale that charged premium prices for its elegant atmosphere and full-service amenities. The catering package she wanted would serve 80 guests with a 3-course dinner and open bar, costing nearly $6,000 before taxes and gratuities. Professional photography, elaborate floral arrangements, and the custom decorations she had designed would add thousands more to the total bill. When I gently suggested that perhaps a smaller, more intimate celebration might be more manageable, Mom's reaction was swift and defensive. She had been looking forward to this milestone for years, she explained, and both she and Dad deserved to celebrate their achievement in style. They had worked hard their entire marriage, made sacrifices for their children's future, and maintained a successful household despite all the challenges that life had thrown at them. This anniversary party wasn't just about them, she insisted, but about showing appreciation for all the family and friends who had supported them over the years. Dad reinforced Mom's position, adding that they had attended numerous celebrations for other couples over the years, always bringing generous gifts and contributing to other people's special occasions. Now it was their turn to be celebrated, and they wanted to do it right. He had already spoken to several colleagues about the upcoming party, and Uncle Frank had cleared his calendar to attend, which Dad considered a significant honor given his brother's busy schedule and successful lifestyle. What my parents didn't explicitly say, but what became increasingly clear through their planning conversations, was that they expected me to make their anniversary vision financially possible. The hints became more direct as the event date approached, with casual comments about how expensive everything had become, and observations about how fortunate they were to have such a successful and generous daughter. Mom would mention the mounting costs with sighs and worried expressions, always followed by comments about how she was sure everything would work out as it always did. The most manipulative aspect of their approach was how they framed my potential financial contribution as an investment in family happiness and reputation, rather than a bailout of their irresponsible spending. This wasn't about them being unable to afford their lifestyle, they implied, but about wanting to create something truly special that would make everyone proud. They painted the anniversary party as a family project, something that would reflect well on all of us, and create positive memories that would last for years to come. As I watched my parents' planning become more elaborate and expensive, while their hints about my expected contribution became more obvious, I found myself facing a decision that would define not only our family relationships, but also my own sense of self-worth and personal boundaries. The thought of disappointing them, of being the reason their dream celebration couldn't happen, filled me with familiar guilt and anxiety. At the same time, the prospect of continuing to enable their financial irresponsibility while they received credit for generosity they couldn't afford made me increasingly angry and resentful. For the first time in 3 years of silent financial support, I began to seriously consider what would happen if I simply said no. The conversation that would change everything happened on a humid Thursday evening in late March. I had driven over to my parents' house after work to drop off some tax documents Dad needed for his filing, finding Mom in the kitchen surrounded by wedding planning magazines and printouts from various catering websites. Her laptop displayed an elaborate spreadsheet with guest lists, menu options, and cost estimates that made my accounting-trained eye widen in alarm. She looked up from her planning materials with the kind of excited energy I hadn't seen from her in years, immediately launching into a detailed description of her vision for the perfect anniversary celebration. The Casa Grande ballroom had a beautiful outdoor terrace overlooking a fountain, she explained, which would be perfect for cocktail hour before moving inside for dinner and dancing. She had already spoken with their event coordinator, a lovely woman named Carmen who understood exactly what kind of sophisticated atmosphere Mom wanted to create. The menu she had selected featured filet mignon and salmon as the main course options, with a Caesar salad course and a dessert bar featuring both their anniversary cake and an assortment of mini pastries. The open bar package included premium liquors and a selection of wines that Carmen had recommended based on the sophisticated tastes of their expected guests. Mom had even researched a string quartet for background music during dinner, though she was still debating whether live music was worth the additional expense. As she talked, I found myself calculating the costs in my head, drawing on my experience with event planning from my accounting clients who ran hospitality businesses. The venue rental alone would be at least $4,000 for a Saturday evening, and the catering package she described would easily run $6,000 to $7,000 for 80 guests. Add in alcohol, music, flowers, photography, and all the other details she was considering, and the total cost would approach $15,000. Dad joined us in the kitchen as Mom was showing me pictures of centerpiece options, immediately sensing the excitement in the air and encouraging Mom to share her latest discoveries with me. He had been thinking about who to invite from his school colleagues, he mentioned, and had already started reaching out to former students who had stayed in touch over the years. Several of his teaching friends had expressed enthusiasm about celebrating his milestone anniversary, and he was particularly pleased that the principal and assistant principal had both promised to attend. The guest list had grown to include not just immediate family and close friends, but extended family members who would be traveling from California and Texas, former neighbors who had moved away but maintained friendships, and professional colleagues from both of their workplaces. Mom had created a detailed chart tracking RSVPs, dietary restrictions, and seating arrangements that would honor various family dynamics and social relationships. The complexity of her planning rivaled some of the corporate events I had helped organize through my accounting work. What struck me most during this conversation was how naturally my parents assumed their anniversary dream would become reality, despite never explicitly discussing how they planned to pay for it. When I gently asked about the budget for all these elaborate plans, Dad waved off my concern with a casual comment about how they had been saving for this celebration for months. Mom added that they had some money set aside, and between Dad's summer teaching income and her employee bonuses from the boutique, they were confident they could make it work. Their confidence seemed so genuine that I almost believed they had actually managed to save enough money for this celebration, despite my intimate knowledge of their ongoing financial struggles. Perhaps they had found a way to cut expenses and build up their savings without needing my continued support. Maybe Dad had taken on additional tutoring work, or Mom had increased her hours at the boutique. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that their financial situation had genuinely improved, and that I could simply enjoy their happiness without worrying about the inevitable request for help. That hope lasted exactly 3 days, until Mom called me during my lunch break with a tone of voice I had learned to recognize as the precursor to a financial crisis. The deposit for the venue was due by the end of the week, she explained, and their savings account was showing a lower balance than expected due to some unexpected expenses. Dad's car had needed expensive brake repairs, and their homeowner's insurance premium had increased significantly when it renewed the previous month. These weren't major problems, just unfortunate timing that had temporarily disrupted their careful planning. The deposit amount was $2,500, which would secure their preferred date and lock in the pricing package they had negotiated with Carmen. If they missed this deadline, not only would they lose their reservation, but they would also forfeit the discount pricing that Carmen had offered based on booking 6 months in advance. Mom had already put down a smaller holding deposit on her credit card, but the venue required the full amount to finalize their contract. As she explained the situation, I could hear the mixture of anxiety and hope in her voice that had become so familiar over the past 3 years. She wasn't directly asking me for money, instead providing information about their circumstances and trusting that I would offer the solution they needed. This approach had become their standard method of requesting financial help, allowing them to maintain the fiction that they weren't dependent on my support while ensuring that I understood exactly how I could resolve their latest crisis. The manipulation was so subtle and well-practiced that I almost didn't recognize it as manipulation at all. Instead, it felt like a natural family conversation where a loving daughter would obviously want to help her parents achieve their dreams. The amount wasn't enormous by the standards of what I had already contributed to their lifestyle, and the cause seemed more worthy than some of their previous financial emergencies. This was a once-in-a-lifetime celebration, not just another month of covering their regular expenses. I found myself agreeing to transfer the deposit money before fully processing what I was committing to. Once again, I was enabling their inability to live within their means, but this time the stakes felt higher, because the consequences of their financial irresponsibility would be publicly visible to 80 guests who believed my parents were successful and stable. If the anniversary party failed due to lack of funds, it wouldn't just be a private family embarrassment, but a public humiliation that would affect their standing in their community. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated with increasing frequency and larger amounts. The catering required a 50% deposit, which came to nearly $3,000. The photographer wanted payment in advance, adding another $800 to the growing total. Mom decided that she and Dad needed new outfits for their special day, leading to a shopping trip that resulted in a $900 credit card bill that exceeded their available limit. Each expense was presented as the final piece needed to complete their perfect celebration, and each time I found myself transferring money to cover costs they had committed to without having funds available. The most frustrating aspect of this escalating financial commitment was watching my parents accept praise and admiration from family and friends for their generosity and success. When Aunt Patricia visited and saw the elaborate planning materials spread across Mom's dining room table, she commented on how wonderful it was that Bob and Linda were able to celebrate their milestone in such style. Uncle Frank, when told about the upcoming celebration during a Sunday family barbecue, nodded approvingly and mentioned how smart they had been to save for this kind of meaningful celebration, rather than wasting money on smaller, less memorable events. Mike, meanwhile, remained completely oblivious to the financial reality behind our parents' anniversary plans. When Mom showed him pictures of the venue and described the menu, he responded with genuine enthusiasm and pride in their achievement. He immediately began planning his own contribution to the celebration, designing custom invitations and a commemorative poster that would display photos from their 25 years of marriage. His artistic talents would make the party even more special, and he was excited to play such an important role in honoring our parents' milestone. His innocence about the true financial situation behind the celebration made me feel increasingly isolated and resentful. While he got to be the creative, supportive son who enhanced their special day with his artistic gifts, I was relegated to the role of silent financial enabler, providing the foundation that made everything possible while receiving no recognition for my sacrifice. If anyone asked how our parents could afford such an elaborate celebration, the credit would go to their careful planning and hard work, not to my depleted savings account. As the anniversary date approached, I began experiencing physical symptoms of stress that I had never dealt with before. I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, mentally calculating the total amount I had contributed to their lifestyle and wondering how much more they would expect me to provide. My appetite decreased, and I lost weight without trying, something that concerned my coworkers enough that they began asking if I was feeling well. The financial pressure was affecting my own quality of life in ways that extended far beyond just having less money in my savings account. My apartment, which had always been my refuge from family drama, began to feel like a reminder of what I was sacrificing to maintain my parents' facade. I had been planning to replace my aging furniture and maybe take a vacation to somewhere warm and relaxing, but those plans were now impossible, given how much of my income was being redirected to their anniversary celebration. I was living below my means so that they could live far above theirs, and the unfairness of this arrangement was becoming impossible to ignore. The breaking point in my growing resentment came during a family dinner 2 weeks before the anniversary party, when Dad began telling stories about some of his former students who had invited him to their own weddings and milestone celebrations. He spoke with obvious pride about how these young people valued his influence in their lives enough to include him in their most important moments, and how rewarding it was to see them successful and settled in their adult lives. Mom chimed in with her own stories about customers at the boutique who had become friends over the years, many of whom would be attending the anniversary party. She had built genuine relationships with these women, she explained, helping them find perfect outfits for their own special occasions and celebrating their life milestones alongside them. The upcoming party would be an opportunity to show appreciation for all these friendships and connections that had enriched their marriage over the years. As I listened to them talk about the meaningful relationships they had built and the gratitude they felt for the people who would be celebrating with them, I realized that I was completely absent from their narrative. Despite being the person who was actually making their celebration possible, they spoke about their anniversary party as if it were entirely the result of their own efforts and relationships. My financial contribution was so invisible to them that they had genuinely forgotten it existed, viewing their upcoming celebration as a natural consequence of their own success and popularity. This invisibility was perhaps more painful than the financial burden itself. I could have managed the monetary cost of their anniversary party if it had been acknowledged as a gift from me to them, a way of honoring their marriage and showing appreciation for their role as my parents. Instead, it felt like I was paying for the privilege of watching them receive credit for achievements that were only possible because of my sacrifice. The final straw came 3 days before the anniversary party, when Mom called to inform me that they had decided to upgrade several elements of their celebration. The string quartet had a last-minute opening and could perform during the cocktail hour, adding only $500 to their total cost. The florist had suggested additional centerpieces that would make the room look more elegant, costing another $300. Most significantly, they had decided to provide welcome bags for out-of-town guests, filled with local Arizona treats and personalized items that would create lasting memories of their special weekend. These upgrades, Mom explained with obvious excitement, would make their anniversary party truly memorable and demonstrate the level of care and attention they had put into celebrating with their loved ones. Carmen at the venue had assured them that these additions would elevate their event from nice to spectacular, creating the kind of celebration the guests would talk about for years to come. The total additional cost was only $1,200, a small price to pay for making their once-in-a-lifetime celebration absolutely perfect. As she detailed these last-minute improvements, I found myself mentally calculating that I had now committed to funding nearly $14,000 of their anniversary celebration, money that represented months of my salary and years of careful saving. More importantly, I realized that their willingness to continue adding expenses right up until the event date showed a complete disregard for the financial impact their decisions were having on my life. They had become so accustomed to my silent support that they no longer even considered whether I could afford to fund their increasingly elaborate lifestyle. That night, I sat in my apartment with my laptop open to the spreadsheet where I tracked every dollar I had transferred to my parents over the past 3 years. The total was staggering, representing more money than many people earned in an entire year. I had depleted my emergency fund, delayed my own life goals, and compromised my financial security to enable their irresponsible spending, all while watching them accept praise and admiration for the success that my sacrifice had made possible. For the first time since this pattern had begun, I allowed myself to imagine what would happen if I simply stopped providing the financial support they had come to expect. Would they be forced to acknowledge their actual financial situation and make realistic decisions about their lifestyle? Would they finally appreciate the extent of my contribution to their comfort and status? Or would they find other ways to maintain their facade, perhaps by borrowing money they had no realistic way to repay, or by cutting expenses in ways that would actually improve their long-term financial health? As I stared at the numbers on my screen, I realized that I had unknowingly created a situation where my parents' public humiliation had become my private responsibility. Their anniversary party was no longer just a celebration of their marriage, but a test of whether I was willing to continue enabling their financial irresponsibility indefinitely. The thought of watching them receive praise and congratulations for a celebration I had funded, while continuing to be invisible in their narrative of success, filled me with the anger I had never allowed myself to fully acknowledge. For the first time in 3 years, I began to seriously consider what would happen if I decided to make my contributions visible, forcing my parents and their guests to confront the reality behind the carefully constructed facade they were all celebrating. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, representing a level of honesty and self-advocacy that felt both necessary and potentially destructive to every family relationship I valued. But as I looked at the financial records spread across my laptop screen, I realized that the current situation was already destructive, just in ways that only I could see. My parents had become so comfortable with my silent support that they no longer viewed me as a separate person with my own needs and limitations, but rather as an extension of their own financial resources. This anniversary party would be the ultimate expression of that dynamic, a public celebration of their success that was entirely dependent on my invisible sacrifice. The question was no longer whether I could afford to continue funding their lifestyle, but whether I could afford not to finally speak the truth about what their success had actually cost. The morning of the anniversary celebration dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect Arizona weather that made everyone grateful to live in the desert. I woke up early in my apartment, staring at the ceiling and feeling a strange mixture of dread and anticipation about the day ahead. My phone showed 17 missed calls and 12 text messages, all from Mom, sent between 5 and 7 in the morning. The panic in her voice was immediately evident when I listened to the first voicemail. Carmen from Casa Grande Ballroom had called at dawn with a crisis that threatened to derail the entire celebration. The florist they had contracted for the elaborate centerpieces had experienced a delivery truck breakdown, leaving them without the custom arrangements that Mom had spent weeks designing. The backup florist Carmen recommended could provide suitable replacements, but they would cost an additional $800 and would need to be paid immediately to guarantee delivery before the 4 o'clock setup time. Mom's voice grew increasingly frantic as she explained that the replacement flowers were actually more beautiful than their original choice, featuring exotic orchids and premium roses that would make their reception tables look like something from a luxury wedding magazine. The problem was that Dad's paycheck wouldn't be deposited until Monday, and their checking account was already stretched thin from the final venue payments and catering adjustments they had made earlier in the week. By the time I called her back, Mom had worked herself into a state of near hysteria about the possibility of having bare tables at their anniversary celebration. She had already called 3 relatives asking for short-term loans, but everyone seemed to be dealing with their own financial challenges. Aunt Patricia was between jobs, Uncle Frank was renovating his kitchen, and her friend Rosa was saving for her daughter's college tuition. The florist needed an answer within 2 hours, and Mom couldn't bear the thought of explaining to their 80 guests why their elegant celebration looked unfinished and cheap. As I listened to her increasingly desperate explanations, I felt a familiar sense of resigned inevitability settle over me. Once again, I would be the solution to their latest crisis, the invisible safety net that allowed their dreams to become reality. The $800 would bring my total contribution to their anniversary celebration to nearly $15,000. Money that represented more than a quarter of my annual salary and the complete depletion of my carefully maintained emergency fund. I transferred the money while still on the phone with Mom, listening to her immediate transformation from panic to overwhelming gratitude. She promised that this would be the last unexpected expense, that everything else was completely handled and paid for. The relief in her voice was so profound that I almost felt guilty for having hesitated, even briefly, before solving her problem. This was what daughters did for their parents, she reminded me, and she would never forget how I had saved their special day from disaster. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now paying for flowers that would decorate tables where guests would toast my parents' financial wisdom and success. These same guests would admire the elegant centerpieces, while praising Bob and Linda for their ability to create such a beautiful celebration, never knowing that the exotic orchids they were admiring existed only because their daughter had sacrificed her own financial security to maintain her parents' facade. By noon, I was at my parents' house helping with last-minute preparations, watching Mom transform into the radiant hostess she had always dreamed of being. She moved through their beautifully renovated home with obvious pride, pointing out details to arriving out-of-town relatives who expressed amazement at how well she and Dad were doing. The house did look spectacular, with its updated kitchen, refinished hardwood floors, and professionally landscaped backyard. All improvements that had been funded through a combination of my direct contributions and the mortgage payments I had covered when their own resources fell short. Mike arrived with his girlfriend Sarah, a sweet elementary school teacher who clearly adored his artistic talents and bohemian lifestyle. He had spent the morning at his downtown loft putting finishing touches on the commemorative poster he had created for the reception, a beautiful collage of photos from our parents' 25 years together, arranged around quotes about love and commitment. His work was genuinely impressive, and I felt a pang of envy watching him receive enthusiastic praise from relatives who saw his contribution as both creative and thoughtful. The contrast between our roles in making this celebration possible couldn't have been more stark. Mike's artistic gift would be prominently displayed at the reception, signed with his name and admired by every guest who attended. My financial contribution, which had made the entire event possible, would remain completely invisible, known only to me and reduced to anonymous bank transfers that my parents had somehow convinced themselves didn't really count as help. Uncle Frank arrived with his wife Elena, immediately commenting on how beautiful Mom looked and how proud he was of his younger brother for building such a successful life and marriage. Dad basked in the praise, describing their anniversary celebration as a reflection of their shared values and careful planning over the years. He mentioned how important it was to him that they could celebrate properly, honoring not just their marriage but also the community of friends and family who had supported them throughout their journey together. As I listened to Dad speak about their careful planning, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom to avoid saying something I would regret. The careful planning he was describing had consisted entirely of making commitments they couldn't afford and expecting me to provide the money to fulfill them. Their successful life was built on my silent sacrifice, and their ability to celebrate properly existed only because I had prioritized their dreams over my own financial stability. Aunt Patricia arrived with her husband and teenage daughter, immediately expressing amazement at how elegant Mom looked in her new dress and jewelry. She asked pointed questions about where Mom had found such beautiful pieces, clearly trying to calculate how much they had cost and whether she could afford similar items for her own special occasions. Mom deflected these inquiries with practiced skill, mentioning employee discounts and special sales that had made her purchases more affordable than they appeared. The jewelry Patricia was admiring had actually been purchased during one of Mom's shopping emergencies, when she decided that her existing accessories weren't elegant enough for such an important celebration. The necklace and earrings had cost nearly $400, charged to a credit card that was already at its limit, and paid off with money I had transferred the following day. Every compliment Patricia offered about Mom's sophisticated style was unknowingly praising my financial sacrifice rather than my parents' good taste or shopping skills. As the afternoon progressed and more relatives arrived, I found myself observing the celebration with a mixture of pride and resentment that felt increasingly difficult to manage. The house really did look beautiful, filled with flowers I had paid for and decorated with Mike's artwork. Mom was radiant in her expensive dress, graciously accepting compliments and expressing gratitude for everyone's presence at their special celebration. Dad moved through the crowd with obvious happiness, telling stories about their marriage and their excitement about the evening's formal reception. Everyone who attended the pre-party gathering expressed genuine affection for my parents and obvious admiration for their success in creating such a beautiful life together. These weren't people who were easily impressed or prone to empty flattery, but rather friends and family members who had known Bob and Linda for decades and could appreciate how much effort and planning had gone into creating this milestone celebration. Their praise felt both deserved and completely misplaced. My parents had created a beautiful marriage and raised 2 children who loved them deeply. They had built meaningful relationships with friends, family, and colleagues who genuinely wanted to celebrate their happiness. Dad really was an excellent teacher who had positively influenced thousands of students over his career, and Mom really did have impeccable taste and social skills that made every gathering more enjoyable. What felt unbearably false was the assumption that their financial success and lifestyle reflected their own earning power and planning abilities. Every compliment about their beautiful home, elegant clothes, and generous hospitality was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how their lifestyle was actually funded. I had become an invisible partner in their marriage, contributing financially to their success while remaining completely absent from the narrative they shared with others. The breaking point came during the drive to Casa Grande Ballroom, when I found myself in the car with Mom, Dad, and Mike, listening to them express excitement about the evening ahead. Mom was particularly animated about the menu, describing each course to Mike and explaining how she had worked with the catering manager to create a dining experience that would impress their most sophisticated guests. Dad added details about the wine selection, mentioning that he had researched each variety to ensure they would complement the meal perfectly. As they talked about the careful attention they had paid to every detail, I realized that they had completely rewritten the history of how this celebration had come together. In their minds, the anniversary party was the result of their own planning, saving, and hard work, with my financial contributions somehow transformed into background support that didn't really count as part of the story. They weren't consciously lying or deliberately taking credit for my sacrifice, but rather engaging in the kind of selective memory that allowed them to maintain their self-image as successful, independent adults. Mike responded to their descriptions with obvious pride in their achievement, commenting on how impressive it was that they had managed to plan such an elaborate celebration while maintaining their regular responsibilities. He was particularly amazed by the menu Mom described, mentioning that he had never attended such an elegant dinner party and feeling honored to be part of such a special family milestone. His innocent enthusiasm made my growing anger feel even more complicated and painful. Mike genuinely believed that our parents had achieved something remarkable through their own efforts, and his pride in their success was completely authentic. If I revealed the truth about how their celebration was actually funded, I wouldn't just be exposing my parents' financial irresponsibility, but also destroying Mike's admiration for their achievement and his innocent joy in being part of their special day. Casa Grande Ballroom exceeded even Mom's elaborate descriptions, with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked perfectly manicured gardens. The outdoor terrace where cocktail hour would be held featured a stunning fountain surrounded by the exotic flowers that had caused such panic earlier in the day. Professional staff members moved efficiently through the space, setting up bars and arranging furniture with the kind of attention to detail that justified the venue's premium pricing. Carmen greeted us at the entrance with obvious pride in how beautiful the space looked, pointing out specific elements that she knew would please Mom and Dad. The centerpieces had arrived perfectly on time and looked even more spectacular than the original design, she assured us, creating exactly the elegant atmosphere that Mom had envisioned for their celebration. The string quartet was already setting up in the corner of the main dining room, tuning their instruments and preparing the classical repertoire that would provide sophisticated background music throughout the evening. As we walked through the space, Mom and Dad expressed amazement at how perfectly everything had come together, praising Carmen's professionalism and attention to detail. They posed for pictures near the fountain, looking genuinely happy and proud of the beautiful celebration they had created. Other early arriving guests began to appear, immediately commenting on the elegance of the venue and expressing enthusiasm about the evening ahead. Watching my parents receive compliments and admiration for the beautiful setting they had provided for their guests, I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing the celebration from outside my own body. The flowers were gorgeous, the venue was spectacular, and the attention to detail really was impressive. Everyone who attended would have a genuinely memorable evening, and my parents deserved to feel proud of creating such a meaningful celebration of their marriage. What felt surreal was knowing that none of this beauty and elegance would exist without my financial sacrifice, while simultaneously watching my parents accept credit for providing it through their own resources and planning. I had become a ghost in their success story, present in every detail but invisible in every conversation about how the celebration had become possible. The most painful moment came when Uncle Frank approached me during cocktail hour, expressing admiration for how well my parents were doing and how impressed he was with their ability to create such an elegant celebration. He mentioned that he had been worried about Bob's financial security on a teacher's salary, but seeing this anniversary party had convinced him that his younger brother had learned to manage money much better than Frank had given him credit for. He went on to praise Mom's sophistication and style, commenting that she had clearly developed excellent taste and budgeting skills over the years. The celebration reflected well on their entire family, he said, and he was proud to have relatives who understood the importance of marking life's milestones with proper ceremony and attention to detail. His praise was sincere and heartfelt, making it even more painful to hear him attribute my parents' apparent success to qualities they didn't actually possess. As I stood on the elegant terrace, surrounded by 80 guests who were enjoying cocktails and hors d'oeuvre that I had paid for, while listening to compliments about my parents' financial wisdom and success, I finally acknowledged a truth I had been avoiding for months. This situation had to end, and it had to end tonight. I could no longer continue enabling their irresponsible spending while watching them receive credit for generosity they couldn't afford and success they hadn't earned. The question was no longer whether I should speak up, but how and when to reveal the truth in a way that would force my parents to confront the reality of their financial dependence without completely destroying their relationships with the family and friends who had come to celebrate with them. As I watched Mom graciously accept compliments about her beautiful party while Dad told stories about their careful planning and saving, I realized that the time for subtle hints and private conversations had passed. Tonight, in front of all the people they were trying to impress, I would finally make my invisible contributions visible, regardless of the consequences for our family relationships or their social standing. The anniversary celebration they were so proud of would become the setting for the most difficult conversation our family had ever had, and I would finally stop protecting them from the embarrassment their financial irresponsibility deserved. The moment of truth arrived during the dinner portion of the evening, just as the main course was being served and Dad was preparing to give his planned speech, thanking everyone for celebrating their milestone anniversary. The dining room looked absolutely magical, with candlelight reflecting off crystal glasses and the string quartet providing a sophisticated backdrop to the conversations happening at each elegantly decorated table. Mom was glowing with happiness, moving gracefully between tables to chat with guests and accept their compliments about the beautiful celebration she had organized. I had been sitting at the family table, mechanically eating the expensive filet mignon, while listening to relatives praise my parents' success and express amazement at their ability to host such an elaborate party. Aunt Patricia had spent the entire meal questioning Mom about the details of how she had managed to plan such a sophisticated event, clearly hoping to gather ideas for her own future celebrations. Uncle Frank was regaling the table with stories about other anniversary parties he had attended, concluding that none of them had approached the elegance and attention to detail that Bob and Linda had achieved. Mike was in his element, charming everyone with stories about his art and accepting compliments about the beautiful commemorative poster that now hung prominently near the head table. Several guests had approached him during cocktail hour to inquire about commissioning similar pieces for their own special occasions, and he was clearly thriving in the role of the talented son, whose creativity had enhanced his parents' special day. The breaking point came when Dad stood up to begin his speech, tapping his champagne glass to get the attention of the 80 guests who had gathered to honor their marriage. The room fell quiet as he began speaking about the journey he and Mom had taken together, the challenges they had overcome, and the success they had built through hard work, careful planning, and mutual support. His voice carried the confidence and warmth that had made him such an effective teacher, and the guests responded with obvious affection and respect. He spoke about the importance of living within your means, while still celebrating life's important milestones, praising Mom for her ability to manage their household finances while creating a beautiful home and lifestyle. He mentioned how proud he was that they had been able to save for this celebration without compromising their financial security, demonstrating to their children and grandchildren the rewards of patience and responsible planning. As he continued talking about their financial wisdom and success, while 80 guests nodded in admiration and raised their glasses in tribute to his and Mom's achievement, something inside me finally snapped. The combination of champagne, exhaustion, and months of suppressed resentment created a perfect storm of emotions that I could no longer contain. Without fully planning what I was going to say, I stood up from my chair and interrupted Dad's speech. The words came out louder and more forcefully than I had intended, cutting through the elegant atmosphere like a knife. I told the room that I needed to share something important about my parents' financial success that Dad had somehow forgotten to mention in his speech. The sudden silence was deafening, with 80 pairs of eyes turning to look at me in confusion and concern. Mom's face went pale, and I could see her immediately understanding that I was about to destroy the careful facade she had worked so hard to maintain. I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app that showed my recent transaction history, holding it up so that the guests at nearby tables could see the long list of transfers to my parents' accounts. My voice grew stronger and clearer as I began reading the amounts and dates, starting with the $2,500 venue deposit and working backward through 3 years of mortgage payments, car loans, credit card bills, and emergency expenses that I had covered to keep my parents' lifestyle afloat. The room remained frozen in shocked silence as I explained that their beautiful home renovations, luxury vehicles, and elegant anniversary celebration had been funded not by their own careful saving and financial planning, but by my depleted emergency fund and sacrificed future goals. I told them that my parents' combined $65,000 annual income could never have supported the lifestyle everyone was admiring, and that I had been secretly subsidizing their expenses for years while they accepted praise and credit for success they couldn't afford. Dad tried to interrupt me, his voice shaking with embarrassment and anger, but I continued speaking over his protests. I explained to the stunned guests that the exotic flowers they were admiring had required an $800 emergency transfer that morning, that Mom's elegant dress and jewelry had been purchased on maxed-out credit cards that I had paid off, and that the premium menu they were enjoying existed only because I had covered the catering deposits when my parents' checking account came up short. Mom finally found her voice, standing up and shouting that I was ruining their lives, that I was destroying their reputation in front of everyone they cared about, and that I was being cruel and vindictive for reasons she couldn't understand. Her voice broke as she accused me of betraying their trust and humiliating them in the worst possible way, in front of family and friends who would never look at them the same way again. The accusation that I was ruining their lives triggered an explosion of anger that had been building for 3 years. I asked her whose life was actually being ruined by this arrangement, pointing out that I was 31 years old with no savings, no emergency fund, and no ability to plan for my own future because I was too busy funding their fantasies. I told the room that I had delayed buying a house, canceled vacation plans, and worked extra hours to generate the income needed to support their irresponsible spending while they bragged about their financial wisdom to anyone who would listen. Mike stood up, his face a mixture of shock and confusion, asking if what I was saying was really true. When I confirmed that I had been paying his studio rent for over 2 years, along with most of his living expenses, his expression shifted to something approaching horror. He had genuinely believed that our parents were successfully supporting his artistic career, and learning that his lifestyle was actually dependent on my sacrifice seemed to devastate him even more than the revelation about their anniversary party. Uncle Frank, who had spent the evening praising Bob's financial acumen, looked completely bewildered as he processed the information I had just shared. He asked Dad directly if I was telling the truth, if their lifestyle really was dependent on my financial support, and if the success he had been admiring was actually built on their daughter's sacrifice. Dad's inability to deny my accusations served as confirmation, and I could see Frank's respect and admiration crumbling in real time. Aunt Patricia, who had been so impressed by Mom's sophistication and style, asked pointed questions about how long this arrangement had been going on, and whether other family members knew about it. When I explained that I had been the sole source of my parents' financial stability for 3 years, and that everyone's praise for their success had been based on a complete misunderstanding of their actual situation, several guests began gathering their belongings and making excuses to leave early. The elegant anniversary celebration that had been designed to showcase my parents' success and stability quickly devolved into the most uncomfortable social situation any of us had ever experienced. Guests who had been laughing and enjoying themselves moments earlier were now exchanging worried glances and having whispered conversations about what they had just witnessed. The beautiful venue, expensive catering, and professional entertainment suddenly felt like props in a theater production that had been exposed as completely artificial. Carmen, the event coordinator, approached our table to ask if everything was all right and whether they needed to make any adjustments to the evening schedule. The professional concern in her voice only highlighted how completely the celebration had been derailed by my revelation. The string quartet continued playing their classical selections, providing an incongruously elegant soundtrack to the family meltdown that was happening in front of 80 increasingly uncomfortable witnesses. Mom disappeared into the bathroom, presumably to collect herself and figure out how to salvage some dignity from the situation. Dad remained at the head table, staring at his untouched dinner, while fielding awkward questions from relatives who were trying to understand what they had just learned about his family's financial situation. Mike sat in stunned silence, clearly processing the implications of everything I had revealed and trying to reconcile his understanding of our family with the reality I had just exposed. The immediate aftermath of my revelation was chaos, with some guests expressing support for my decision to speak up, while others seemed angry that I had chosen such a public venue for such a private family matter. Several people approached me individually to say that they admired my courage in finally telling the truth, but their support felt hollow, given the destruction I had just caused to relationships that had taken decades to build. The most painful reactions came from family members who had genuinely cared about my parents, and felt betrayed by learning that their admiration had been based on deception. Uncle Frank, in particular, seemed personally hurt that Bob had allowed him to praise financial wisdom that didn't exist, making him feel foolish for the advice he had given his own children based on his brother's apparent success. Over the following hour, nearly half the guests found reasons to leave early, creating an increasingly awkward atmosphere for those who remained. The anniversary celebration that was supposed to last until midnight ended before 10 o'clock. With Mom and Dad saying goodbye to their remaining guests while trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, despite the devastating revelations that had dominated the evening. The ride home was conducted in complete silence, with the four of us sitting in Dad's car processing what had just happened and trying to figure out how to move forward from such a public and painful confrontation. Mom stared out the window with tears streaming down her face, while Dad gripped the steering wheel and occasionally shook his head, as if he still couldn't believe what I had done. Mike sat beside me in the back seat, occasionally glancing in my direction but remaining completely quiet. When we arrived at my parents' house, Mom finally spoke, telling me that I had destroyed not just their anniversary celebration, but their relationships with family and friends, who would never trust them again. She accused me of being selfish and cruel, of choosing the worst possible moment to air grievances that could have been discussed privately. Her pain was genuine and devastating, making me question whether my decision to speak publicly had been motivated by a desire for honesty or a need for revenge. Dad's reaction was more complex, combining anger at my public betrayal with what seemed like relief that their financial secrets were finally in the open. He admitted that the pressure of maintaining their facade had been exhausting, and that he had known for months that their dependence on my support was unsustainable. While he was furious about how I had chosen to reveal the truth, he acknowledged that some version of this conversation had been inevitable. Mike's response was perhaps the most painful to witness. He expressed genuine remorse for unknowingly benefiting from my sacrifice while remaining oblivious to our parents' financial struggles. He offered to move out of his expensive loft immediately and find a way to repay me for the support I had provided, though we both knew that his irregular artist's income made significant repayment unlikely. His innocent pride in our parents' generosity had been replaced by guilt and confusion about his own role in their financial irresponsibility. The weeks following the anniversary disaster were marked by a gradual reckoning with the new reality I had created, by exposing our family's financial dysfunction. Some relatives, particularly Uncle Frank, expressed appreciation for my honesty and admitted that they had always wondered how Bob and Linda managed to live so well on their modest incomes. Others, including Aunt Patricia, seemed to blame me for destroying family harmony and embarrassing everyone who had attended the celebration. Mom struggled the most with the aftermath, finding it difficult to face friends and coworkers who now knew the truth about their financial situation. Her part-time job at the boutique became a source of stress rather than enjoyment, as she worried that customers would treat her differently now that they knew she couldn't actually afford the clothing she sold. The identity she had built around being sophisticated and successful felt completely shattered, leaving her unsure of how to interact with people who had previously admired her lifestyle. Dad handled the situation more pragmatically, using the forced honesty as an opportunity to finally address their long-term financial problems. He took on additional tutoring work and began researching ways to reduce their monthly expenses, including the possibility of downsizing their house and trading their luxury vehicles for more affordable options. The relief of no longer having to pretend they were financially successful seemed to outweigh his embarrassment about their dependence on my support. Mike surprised everyone by rising to the occasion in ways that demonstrated genuine maturity and growth. He moved out of his expensive loft into a shared apartment with other artists, took on freelance projects that paid actual money rather than just providing creative fulfillment, and established a payment plan to gradually reimburse me for the support I had provided. His transformation from financially dependent dreamer to responsible adult happened faster than anyone had expected. The most significant change was in my own relationship with financial boundaries and family expectations. For the first time in 3 years, I was able to focus on my own goals and needs rather than constantly calculating how much of my income would be needed to maintain my parents' lifestyle. I began rebuilding my emergency fund, researching houses I might want to buy, and planning the vacation I had been postponing since I started supporting my parents. The process of reestablishing healthy family relationships was slow and sometimes painful, requiring honest conversations about expectations, boundaries, and mutual respect that we had never been forced to have before. Mom gradually came to understand that my years of silent support had been as damaging to me as their financial irresponsibility had been to them, and that my decision to speak publicly had been motivated by desperation rather than malice. 6 months after the anniversary celebration, our family dynamic had shifted into something more honest and sustainable, though it took time for everyone to adjust to the new reality. Mom found a full-time position with better benefits, Dad expanded his tutoring business into a legitimate side income, and Mike began building a client base that could actually support his artistic ambitions without family subsidies. The anniversary party that was supposed to celebrate my parents' success instead became the catalyst for genuine positive changes that none of us had been brave enough to initiate through private conversations. While the public nature of my revelation had been painful and embarrassing for everyone involved, it had also forced us to confront unhealthy patterns that might have continued indefinitely otherwise. Looking back, I realized that my decision to expose our family's financial truth at such a public moment was both the most destructive and most loving thing I could have done. By refusing to continue enabling their irresponsible behavior, I had forced all of us to grow into more honest and sustainable versions of ourselves. The anniversary celebration they had dreamed of was ruined, but the relationships that emerged from that wreckage were stronger and more authentic than anything we had built on the foundation of financial deception. The lesson I learned from that devastating but necessary confrontation was that sometimes the most caring thing you can do for people you love is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their choices. My parents needed to face the reality of their financial situation, Mike needed to understand the true cost of his lifestyle, and I needed to learn that my own needs and boundaries were just as important as everyone else's comfort and pride. The words "you ruined our lives" that Mom spoke that night eventually proved to be both accurate and incomplete. I had ruined the lives they were living, but only to make room for the lives they were actually capable of sustaining. Sometimes destruction is the first step toward building something real and lasting, even when the process is more painful than anyone could have imagined. The weeks immediately following the anniversary disaster felt like living in the aftermath of an earthquake, with aftershocks of embarrassment and recrimination rippling through every aspect of our family's social world. I had underestimated how quickly word would spread through our extended network of relatives, family, friends, and community connections. Within days, it seemed like everyone who had ever known the Martinez family had heard some version of what had transpired at Casa Grande Ballroom, though the details grew increasingly distorted with each retelling. Mrs. Rosa Delgado, our longtime family friend who had attended the celebration, called Mom 3 days after the party, with what she described as concern but felt more like morbid curiosity. She wanted to understand exactly what had happened, she explained, because several people from their church had been asking her about the dramatic scene they had heard had unfolded during Bob and Linda's anniversary speech. The way she phrased her questions made it clear that the story had already evolved from a private family financial discussion into something resembling a public mental breakdown on my part. Mom handled these inquiries with as much dignity as she could manage, but I could see the stress taking a physical toll on her. She had always been someone who took pride in her appearance and social presence, but now she seemed to shrink whenever we encountered people in public who might have heard about our family situation. The grocery store, the post office, even church became potential minefields, where she might run into someone who would look at her with a mixture of pity and judgment that she found unbearable. Dad's experience was somewhat different, partly because his professional reputation as a teacher provided him with a built-in source of respect that transcended our family drama. His colleagues at the high school had heard rumors about financial difficulties, but they also knew him as someone who had dedicated his career to helping young people succeed, often using his own money to buy supplies for students whose families couldn't afford them. The irony that he had been using money I provided to fund his classroom generosity wasn't lost on me, but it did seem to protect him from some of the harshest social judgment. Mike's response to the revelation continued to evolve in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. The initial shock and guilt had given way to a determined effort to understand how he had remained so oblivious to our family's financial reality for so long. He began asking pointed questions about our parents' spending habits, their actual income, and the timeline of my financial involvement that demonstrated a newfound maturity I hadn't seen from him before. During one particularly difficult conversation at his new shared apartment, Mike admitted that he had always known something didn't quite add up about our parents' lifestyle, but had chosen not to examine it too closely because the arrangement benefited him so directly. He had convinced himself that Dad must have received some kind of inheritance, or that Mom was earning more from her boutique job than she let on, because facing the truth would have required him to make changes he wasn't ready to make. His new living situation was a stark contrast to the trendy downtown loft I had been unknowingly subsidizing. The shared apartment was in a converted warehouse space that housed 6 different artists, each renting a small private room while sharing common areas that served as both living space and creative studios. The rent was less than a third of what his previous place had cost, and while the accommodations were basic, the creative energy and collaborative atmosphere seemed to be inspiring him in ways his isolated luxury lifestyle never had. The most surprising development was Mike's decision to organize an art sale specifically to raise money for repaying me. He reached out to every client he had ever worked with, every gallery owner he had met, and every fellow artist in his network to put together a show featuring pieces he had created over the past 2 years. The event, which he called Honesty in Art, was his way of acknowledging publicly that his previous work had been created with financial support he hadn't earned, and that he wanted to begin his career again on more authentic terms. The art show took place 6 weeks after the anniversary party, in the warehouse space where Mike was now living. He had transformed the common area into a makeshift gallery, with professional lighting borrowed from photographer friends and wine donated by local businesses who supported the artistic community. The opening night drew a surprisingly large crowd, including several people who had attended the anniversary celebration and were curious about how Mike was handling the aftermath of our family's public revelation. What made the evening particularly meaningful was Mike's decision to be completely transparent about why he was selling his work. He stood in front of the assembled crowd and explained that he had recently learned his lifestyle had been subsidized by his sister's sacrifice, and that he was selling his art to begin repaying a debt he hadn't even known he owed. His honesty about his own financial ignorance and his commitment to making amends resonated with the audience in ways that surprised everyone, including Mike himself. The art sale was successful beyond anyone's expectations, raising nearly $4,000 that Mike immediately turned over to me as the first installment on his repayment plan. More importantly, the event established him as an artist who was willing to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege and responsibility, leading to commissions and gallery opportunities that were based on respect for his integrity, rather than just admiration for his talent. Meanwhile, Dad was making his own efforts to address the financial problems that had led to our family crisis. He approached the challenge with the same methodical attention to detail that had made him an effective teacher, creating spreadsheets that tracked every expense and identified areas where they could reduce their spending without completely destroying their quality of life. The process forced him to confront just how disconnected their lifestyle had become from their actual earning capacity. The house renovations that had impressed so many relatives and friends now felt like monuments to their financial irresponsibility. Dad began researching the possibility of taking out a home equity loan to consolidate their credit card debt, but the application process required him to document their income and expenses in ways that made the sustainability of their previous lifestyle impossible to ignore. The beautiful kitchen renovation had added value to their home, but not nearly enough to justify the ongoing monthly payments they had been making with money I provided. His expanded tutoring business began generating significant additional income, but it also required him to work evenings and weekends in ways that left him exhausted and stressed. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that Dad was now working extra hours to earn money he could have been saving all along if they had simply lived within their original means. The lesson was valuable but expensive, costing all of us years of financial stability and peace of mind. Mom's journey toward financial independence was perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. She had always defined herself partly through her ability to maintain an elegant lifestyle and sophisticated appearance, and learning to achieve the same goals on a realistic budget required her to develop skills she had never needed before. She began shopping at discount stores, learning to alter her own clothes and finding creative ways to maintain her personal style without the expensive boutique pieces she had grown accustomed to. Her decision to pursue full-time employment was motivated partly by financial necessity and partly by a desire to prove to herself and others that she could contribute meaningfully to their household income. The job she eventually found was as an administrative assistant at a medical office, work that paid well, but required her to develop computer skills and organizational systems that challenged her in ways she hadn't experienced in years. The most difficult aspect of Mom's adjustment was learning to interact with friends and family members who now knew the truth about their financial situation. She had to rebuild relationships based on honesty rather than the carefully curated image she had maintained for so long, and some people proved more supportive than others in helping her navigate this transition. The friends who remained close were those who valued her personality and loyalty more than her ability to host elegant parties or wear expensive clothes. One unexpected source of support came from Aunt Patricia, who revealed during a private conversation that she had always struggled with feelings of inadequacy when comparing her own modest lifestyle to what she had perceived as Linda's success. Learning that her sister's elegant lifestyle had been financially unsustainable actually strengthened their relationship, allowing them to connect on a more authentic level about the challenges of managing household finances and maintaining family relationships. Uncle Frank's reaction was more complex and took longer to resolve. His initial anger at feeling deceived gradually gave way to a recognition that Bob's financial struggles were not fundamentally different from challenges that many families face, and that the real problem had been the deception rather than the difficulties themselves. He began offering practical advice about debt management and small business development, drawing on his own experience building a successful construction company from very modest beginnings. The process of rebuilding trust within our extended family required dozens of individual conversations, each one addressing different aspects of what had happened and why. Some relatives were more forgiving than others, but most eventually came to understand that our family's financial deception had been motivated by pride and fear, rather than malicious intent. The anniversary party disaster became a cautionary tale that several family members referenced when making their own decisions about spending and lifestyle choices. For me, the months following my public revelation were a period of intense self-reflection about my own role in creating and perpetuating the dysfunctional dynamic that had defined our family relationships for years. While I had been the victim of my parents' financial manipulation, I also had to acknowledge that my willingness to provide support without demanding accountability had enabled their irresponsible behavior to continue far longer than it should have. The process of rebuilding my own financial stability was both easier and harder than I had expected. Easier because I no longer had the constant drain of supporting my parents' lifestyle, which immediately freed up over $2,000 per month that I could redirect toward my own goals. Harder because I had to confront the extent to which my identity had become wrapped up in being the family's financial savior, and learning to prioritize my own needs felt selfish even when I knew it was necessary. I began working with a financial advisor to develop a comprehensive plan for rebuilding my emergency fund, saving for a house down payment, and planning for retirement in ways that I had been unable to do while supporting my parents. The advisor was initially shocked when I explained how much money I had been transferring to family members, but she helped me understand that my situation was not as unusual as I had thought, and that many adult children struggle with similar boundary issues around family financial support. The house I eventually purchased was a modest 3-bedroom home in Tempe, close enough to my parents that I could maintain our relationship while far enough away that I could establish clear boundaries about my involvement in their financial decisions. The process of decorating and furnishing my own space with money I had earned and saved was deeply satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated, representing a level of independence and self-determination that I had sacrificed during my years of family financial support. One of the most meaningful changes was my ability to start planning for my own future, rather than constantly reacting to my family's latest financial crisis. I began contributing to retirement accounts, researching graduate school programs that might advance my accounting career, and even planning a vacation to Europe that I had been dreaming about for years but had never been able to afford while funding my parents' lifestyle. The vacation, which I took 8 months after the anniversary party, was a solo trip to Italy that represented everything I had been unable to do while my financial resources were tied up in maintaining my family's facade. I spent 2 weeks exploring Rome, Florence, and the Tuscan countryside, staying in small hotels and eating at local restaurants without worrying about whether my parents might need money for some emergency while I was away. The trip was transformative not just because of the beauty and culture I experienced, but because it represented a fundamental shift in how I thought about my relationship to money and family obligations. For the first time in years, I was able to spend money on my own happiness without guilt or anxiety about whether I should be saving it for some family emergency that might arise. When I returned from Italy, I found that my parents had successfully navigated 2 weeks without any financial support from me, managing a minor car repair and an unexpected medical bill through a combination of Dad's tutoring income and careful budgeting. The experience proved to all of us that they were capable of handling their own financial challenges when they didn't have the option of relying on my support. The first anniversary of their disastrous 25th anniversary party was marked by a small private dinner at their house, with only immediate family in attendance. The contrast with the previous year's elaborate celebration was stark, but the atmosphere was more genuinely warm and connected than any family gathering we had shared in years. We were all older, wiser, and more honest about our respective strengths and weaknesses. Mike brought a home-cooked meal that he had prepared in his shared kitchen, demonstrating culinary skills none of us knew he possessed. Mom had made a simple cake using a recipe she had learned from our grandmother, decorating it with flowers from their garden rather than expensive arrangements from a florist. Dad shared stories about his students and his growing tutoring business, speaking with genuine pride about work he was doing entirely with his own resources. During that quiet dinner, Mom finally apologized for the years of financial manipulation that had led to our family crisis. She acknowledged that their lifestyle had been unsustainable, and that expecting me to fund their dreams while they received credit for the results had been unfair and damaging to everyone involved. Her apology was accompanied by a detailed plan for how they intended to continue managing their finances independently, including specific steps they were taking to ensure they would never again need to rely on my support. Dad's apology focused more on his failure to protect me from the pressure of being the family's financial safety net, and his recognition that he had allowed pride and denial to prevent him from addressing their spending problems before they became a crisis. He expressed genuine admiration for my courage in finally speaking up, even though he acknowledged that the public nature of my revelation had been painful for everyone involved. The conversation that night was the first time our family had talked honestly about money, responsibility, and mutual respect, without the underlying tension of unspoken financial obligations and resentments. We were finally able to relate to each other as adults with separate lives and boundaries, rather than as participants in a dysfunctional system where one person's sacrifice enabled everyone else's irresponsibility. 2 years after the anniversary party that had seemed to destroy our family relationships, we had rebuilt them on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect that was stronger than anything we had shared before. Mom and Dad had successfully transitioned to a lifestyle that matched their actual income. Mike had established himself as a financially independent artist, and I had learned to prioritize my own needs and goals without guilt or anxiety about family obligations. The lesson that emerged from our family's crisis was that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable behavior that is harmful to everyone involved, even when the immediate consequences are painful and embarrassing. My decision to expose our family's financial deception at their anniversary party had felt cruel and destructive in the moment, but it had ultimately forced all of us to grow into more authentic and sustainable versions of ourselves. The words "you ruined our lives" that Mom had spoken in her anger and humiliation that night had proved to be both true and necessary. I had ruined the lives they were living, but only because those lives were built on deception and unsustainable financial practices that were harming all of us in different ways. The lives we built in the aftermath of that destruction were more modest but also more honest, more challenging but also more rewarding. Looking back on the anniversary party disaster, I realized that it had been the catalyst for the most important growth any of us had experienced as adults. We had learned to communicate honestly about difficult topics, to respect each other's boundaries and limitations, and to build relationships based on genuine mutual support, rather than financial manipulation and enabling. The family we became, after facing the truth about our financial dysfunction, was smaller, quieter, and less impressive to outside observers than the family we had pretended to be before. But it was also more genuine, more sustainable, and more capable of providing the kind of emotional support and connection that actually matters in the long run. Sometimes the most devastating confrontations are also the most necessary, leading to healing and growth that would have been impossible without the courage to tell the truth, regardless of the immediate consequences. The third year after the anniversary revelation brought unexpected developments that none of us could have predicted during those dark weeks immediately following the party. What had initially seemed like a family catastrophe had somehow evolved into a catalyst for positive changes that extended far beyond our immediate household, touching the lives of extended family members, friends, and even strangers who heard various versions of our story. The most surprising development came when Dad was approached by the principal of his school about developing a financial literacy curriculum for high school students. Word had somehow reached the administration about his personal experience with financial difficulties and recovery, and rather than viewing this as a professional liability, they saw it as an opportunity to provide students with practical, real-world education about money management from someone who had learned these lessons the hard way. Dad initially resisted the proposal, feeling that his financial mistakes disqualified him from teaching others about responsible money management. The principal, however, argued that his experience with both financial failure and recovery made him uniquely qualified to help students understand the real consequences of spending decisions and the importance of living within their means. She pointed out that most financial education programs were taught by people who had never experienced serious money problems, making their advice feel theoretical and disconnected from students' actual lives. The curriculum Dad eventually developed became one of the most popular elective courses offered at the school, with students responding enthusiastically to his honest discussions about how financial decisions affect family relationships, personal stress levels, and future opportunities. He used sanitized versions of our own family's experience as case studies, helping students understand how small financial compromises can snowball into major problems when left unaddressed. One of the most powerful elements of his course was a section on family financial dynamics, where he discussed how money problems affect everyone in a household, not just the people who create them. Students were particularly engaged when he talked about the pressure that adult children sometimes face to support parents who have made poor financial decisions, and how important it is to establish healthy boundaries around money in family relationships. The success of Dad's financial literacy program led to invitations to speak at other schools throughout the Phoenix area, and eventually to opportunities to present at education conferences about innovative approaches to teaching practical life skills. His transformation from someone who had been financially irresponsible to someone who was helping others avoid similar mistakes became a source of genuine pride for our entire family. Mom's journey toward financial independence took an unexpected turn when she discovered that her experience managing our family's complex financial crisis had given her skills that were valuable in her new workplace. Her ability to track multiple accounts, manage competing priorities, and maintain detailed records while under pressure made her exceptionally effective in her administrative role at the medical office. Within 18 months of starting her full-time position, she had been promoted twice and was eventually asked to help train new employees in the practice's financial management systems. Her supervisor commented that she had never seen someone adapt so quickly to complex administrative responsibilities, not knowing that Mom had essentially been running a complicated financial juggling act for years before being forced to channel those skills into legitimate employment. The confidence Mom gained from professional success began to transform her approach to other aspects of her life as well. She started taking community college courses in business administration, initially just to improve her job performance, but eventually with the goal of potentially starting her own bookkeeping service for small businesses. The woman who had once been completely dependent on my financial support was becoming someone who could help other people manage their money more effectively. Her transformation was perhaps most visible in her changed relationship with material possessions and social status. The mom who had once felt compelled to buy expensive clothes and accessories to maintain her image was replaced by someone who took pride in finding high-quality items at reasonable prices and making them look elegant through careful styling and maintenance. She developed a reputation among her friends as someone who could create sophisticated outfits on modest budgets, leading to requests for shopping advice and wardrobe consulting. Mike's artistic career flourished in ways that surprised everyone, particularly Mike himself. The authenticity and vulnerability he had demonstrated during his Honesty in Art show resonated with the Phoenix arts community, leading to gallery representation and commissions from clients who were drawn to his willingness to address uncomfortable truths about privilege and responsibility in his work. His shared living situation with other artists had evolved into a formal creative collective that pooled resources to rent studio space, share equipment costs, and collaborate on larger projects that none of them could have tackled individually. The financial constraints that had initially seemed like a step backward in his career had actually forced him to develop collaborative skills and business acumen that made him more successful than he had ever been while living alone in his expensive loft. One of Mike's most successful projects was a series of paintings exploring themes of family financial dynamics, inspired by our own experience, but expanded to address broader questions about money, power, and relationships in American families. The series was featured in a solo exhibition at a respected gallery in Scottsdale, with several pieces selling to collectors who were drawn to his honest exploration of subjects that most artists avoided. The exhibition catalog included an artist's statement where Mike wrote openly about his own experience of unknowingly benefiting from family financial sacrifice and his process of learning to create art that was financially sustainable rather than dependent on others' support. His willingness to discuss these personal details in a professional context helped establish him as an artist who was interested in social and economic issues rather than just aesthetic concerns. My own career benefited unexpectedly from the experience of managing our family's financial crisis and recovery. The skills I had developed in tracking complex financial arrangements, creating realistic budgets, and helping people understand the long-term consequences of their spending decisions made me particularly effective in working with small business clients who were struggling with similar challenges. Several of my accounting clients began seeking my advice not just on tax preparation and bookkeeping, but on broader questions about business financial management and personal financial planning. My ability to discuss these topics with empathy and practical experience, rather than just theoretical knowledge, made me more valuable to clients who were dealing with the stress and emotional complexity of financial difficulties. The reputation I developed for helping people navigate financial crises led to referrals, and eventually to opportunities to speak at local business organizations about financial planning for small business owners. My presentations focused on practical strategies for maintaining financial discipline during periods of growth, and warning signs that indicate when a business or individual is living beyond their means. One of the most meaningful developments was my decision to start a small side practice, providing financial counseling specifically for adult children who were struggling with family financial boundary issues. The experience of untangling myself from my parents' financial dependence had taught me how common these situations are, and how few resources exist to help people navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges involved. My first clients were referred by therapists and family counselors who were seeing people struggling with similar dynamics to what our family had experienced. Working with these clients helped me understand that our situation, while extreme in some ways, was actually representative of broader patterns that affect many American families, particularly in communities where adult children are expected to support aging parents, regardless of the financial impact on their own lives. The most challenging case I handled involved a young woman whose parents had been using her excellent credit to obtain loans and credit cards that they had no intention of repaying. Unlike my situation, where I had at least been consciously choosing to provide financial support, she had discovered that her parents had been forging her signature on financial documents for years, destroying her credit rating, and potentially making her liable for debt she had never agreed to take on. Helping her navigate the legal and emotional complexities of that situation required me to research areas of law and family dynamics that I had never encountered before, but it also demonstrated how much I had learned from our own family's experience about the importance of clear boundaries and honest communication around money issues. The financial counseling work became increasingly important to me, both because it helped other people avoid or resolve situations similar to what we had experienced, and because it gave deeper meaning to the painful process our family had gone through. The skills I had developed in managing our crisis, and the insights I had gained about family financial dynamics, were valuable not just for our own recovery, but for helping other families as well. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work was seeing how often families were able to resolve their financial conflicts through honest communication and clear boundary setting, without needing to go through the kind of public confrontation that had marked our own experience. Most of the families I worked with were able to address their problems through private conversations and gradual changes, avoiding the dramatic scene that had characterized our anniversary party revelation. The success of these other families made me realize that while my decision to expose our financial problems publicly had been effective in forcing change, it had also been more extreme than necessary. With better communication skills and more confidence in setting boundaries, I might have been able to achieve similar results through private confrontation and ultimatums, sparing everyone the public embarrassment that had made our situation so painful. However, I also recognized that the extreme nature of our confrontation had been partly necessary, given how entrenched our family's patterns had become, and how resistant my parents had been to acknowledging the unsustainability of their lifestyle. Sometimes dramatic action is required to break through years of denial and avoidance, even when the immediate consequences are devastating for everyone involved. The 5th anniversary of the original party arrived with remarkably little fanfare or anxiety. By that point, the financial revelation that had once seemed like the end of our family relationships had become simply part of our shared history, something we could reference with humor and perspective rather than pain and embarrassment. We celebrated with a backyard barbecue at my house, with each family member contributing food, decorations, or entertainment based on their actual abilities and resources, rather than trying to create an impression of success or sophistication. Mike brought homemade artwork that he had created specifically for the occasion. Dad prepared his famous grilled vegetables using produce from the garden he had started as a money-saving hobby, and Mom made her grandmother's tres leches cake using a recipe that had been passed down through generations. The contrast with the original anniversary celebration was striking, but the atmosphere was infinitely more relaxed and genuinely joyful. We were celebrating not just Mom and Dad's marriage, but our family's successful navigation of a crisis that could easily have destroyed our relationships permanently. The people around the table were older, wiser, and more honest than the family that had sat together at Casa Grande Ballroom 5 years earlier. During that quiet celebration, Dad shared some statistics about his financial literacy program, including feedback from students who had credited the course with helping them avoid credit card debt, make better decisions about student loans, and have productive conversations with their own families about money management. Several former students had stayed in touch to update him on their progress, and their success stories had become a source of genuine pride that far exceeded anything he had felt about our family's artificial lifestyle. Mom talked about her plans to complete her business administration degree and potentially start her own consulting practice, helping small businesses with the kind of administrative challenges that had become her specialty at the medical office. Her confidence in her professional abilities was a remarkable transformation from the woman who had once defined herself primarily through her ability to maintain an elegant appearance and sophisticated social life. Mike shared news about a major commission he had received to create a mural for a community center, a project that would provide steady income for several months, while also allowing him to create art that would be accessible to people who might never visit traditional galleries. His ability to support himself through his artistic work, while also contributing meaningfully to his community, represented the kind of success that was both financially sustainable and personally fulfilling. For my part, I was able to share that I had just closed on a small office space where I could expand my financial counseling practice, and that I had been accepted into a graduate program in financial planning that would allow me to provide even more comprehensive help to families dealing with financial boundary issues. The work had become not just a source of income, but a genuine passion, turning our family's painful experience into something that could benefit others. The evening concluded with all of us acknowledging how much we had learned from the crisis that had once seemed so devastating. We talked about the importance of financial honesty in family relationships, the dangers of enabling irresponsible behavior even when motivated by love, and the value of addressing problems directly rather than hoping they will resolve themselves. Most importantly, we acknowledged that the family we had become was stronger and more authentic than the family we had been before, even though the process of transformation had been more painful than anyone could have anticipated. The facade of financial success that we had maintained for so long had ultimately been less valuable than the genuine relationships and mutual respect that had emerged from its destruction. The lesson that had taken us 5 years to fully understand was that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family members is to refuse to enable their self-destructive behavior, even when the immediate consequences include anger, embarrassment, and damaged relationships. The short-term pain of honest confrontation had ultimately led to long-term growth and healing that would not have been possible if we had continued to avoid addressing our fundamental problems. Our story had become something of a cautionary tale in our extended family and social circle, referenced whenever someone was struggling with similar boundary issues or financial enabling patterns. While the public nature of our confrontation remained embarrassing for everyone involved, the positive outcomes had gradually overshadowed the initial humiliation, creating a narrative of recovery and growth rather than just family dysfunction. The words "you ruined our lives" that Mom had spoken in her anger and despair that night had proved to be both accurate and incomplete. I had indeed ruined the lives we were living, but only because those lives were built on unsustainable patterns that were ultimately harmful to everyone involved. The lives we built in the aftermath of that destruction were more modest in material terms but infinitely richer in terms of honesty, mutual respect, and genuine connection. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that the anniversary party disaster had been the most important thing that ever happened to our family, despite being the most painful at the time. It had forced all of us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our relationships, and to develop skills and perspectives that had ultimately made us more successful and fulfilled than we had ever been while living within our original dysfunctional patterns. The financial records I had displayed that night, which had seemed like weapons of destruction in the moment, had actually been tools of liberation, freeing all of us from roles and expectations that had been limiting our growth and authentic connection. Sometimes the most difficult confrontations are also the most necessary, leading to healing and transformation that would have been impossible through gentler means. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.